slideshow going? Okay. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Steve Jackowicz. I'm from the University of Bridgeport. I'm actually both a clinician in East Asian medicine, having been trained originally in medical school in Korea and then done more extensive training in China. And I also have academic degrees that study the history and formation of East Asian medicine with my PhD through Boston University. So now I teach over at the University of Bridgeport. So we're going to get started with this presentation. So East Asian medicine. So if you're unfamiliar with this, East Asian medicine is the term that we use to describe the pre-modern medical system of what we call the Sinitic sphere, the countries that were influenced by pre-modern China's Confucian system. So China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam are collectively called the Sinitic sphere, and they all developed a similar medical system that shared certain ideas but had some unique formation. So we tend to use this term East Asian medicine to refer to it historically, as opposed to the term traditional Chinese medicine, which defines the blending in modern China of Western and Eastern concepts into that format of medicine. So in the modern day, it's melded a lot of ideas, but there's 4 major approaches: acupuncture, moxibustion, herbs and diet, physical manipulation, which means bone setting and adjustments, and massage, and different types of breathing techniques, all of these being techniques used in East Asian medicine. Now, the focus of today's presentation is really talking about the transplantation of this to the United States, and specifically certain sociocultural dynamics that are going on. So this is the transmission of East Asian medicine to the United States can be broken down into 4 major parts. First part, the closed community period, which was early on from the mid-1800s when East Asians started to migrate to the United States. We call it the closed community period. This is when ethnic enclaves practiced this type of medicine, but it was very much a small and kind of ethnic minority practice. It wasn't mainstreamed, it wasn't licensed, it wasn't well known. However, homeopaths in the United States in the 1800s were aware of acupuncture and sometimes dabbled in that technique also. But that period really, it was a smaller ethnic enclave dynamic. Then we move into a period called the countercultural period, where during the 60s and 70s, you saw this kind of countercultural dynamic occurring, the flower child generation, as we sometimes call it. And there was an appreciation that there were these other approaches to medicine, these kind of herbal medicine, acupuncture. These things were considered to be different. They were considered countercultural. They were funky. They were cool. And it spread in terms of an understanding of it, though it did not become mainstream at that point. Then we moved into a period called the professional licentiate period and a direct pay, meaning that there were licenses developed as the first school in the United States in 1972. The New England School of Acupuncture was developed, and shortly thereafter, by 1976, there was the beginnings of licensure, and then really by the early part of the 1980s, licensure had taken place across most of the United States. But that was a direct pay period where if you sought such services, you had to pay out of pocket. It wasn't really something that you had insurance coverage. And then really starting in the very late 1990s, like 1999, and then the early 2000s, you started to have different insurance companies pay for it, where now acupuncture especially is more mainstreamed, and there are many insurance providers. And even the Veterans Administration has now brought acupuncture in as part of its modalities that it covers. However, certain parts, certain aspects like herbal medicine are not necessarily covered. So these 4 developments of East Asian medicine. But the onus of what we want to talk about today is the idea of Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is an idea, a theory advanced by the scholar Edward Said, starting back, he wrote this book in the 70s, advancing this idea that the West basically exploited the East through the colonial period, first by denigrating the traditional, denigrating the cultures there and saying that there was an ancient higher culture that degraded in India, in China, in Japan. And this is why the West saw as it had a mission to go there and take over. So this really was a type of propaganda. So we call it Orientalism, and it linked everything east of Rome as Oriental. So it really is kind of a denigrating term. Now, Orientalizing is when a practice or a habit or a cultural norm is modified and it corresponds with these beliefs that there is some sort of psychological, some sort of mystical milieu behind whatever practice it might be. So really what I'm looking at today is part of a larger project to talk about this in the East Asian medical community. So many times when people go for East Asian medicine, or even the practitioners, there's a certain baggage of expectation, right? That there's some sort of wisdom, there's a learned Eastern tradition, and that they're not only going to be treated in a physical sense, but a wiser method. Well, this really kind of effuses through the Western, especially the United States, practitioners of East Asian medicine into the East Asian medical schools that are in the United States. There are 46 schools that teach different parts or different aspects of East Asian medicine. And so this drives into this and changes the perception of what goes on. And the most important thing that I want to drive home in this slide is that the techniques, acupuncture, herbal medicine, massage, these techniques have medical efficacy. They work. However, they become wrapped up into a filter of mystical erudition. They get wrapped up in different mystical things. And this really is denying the reality of the effect, and they become meaningful beyond their utility. So if you went to the doctor and got a shot of erythromycin, you hopefully get better from whatever infection you have. But you don't think that the shot of erythromycin somehow mends your soul. But people have that idea about Asian medicine, that it mends your soul, that somehow it's wiser. And this is the Orientalizing dynamic that we want to talk about, okay? So I'm only going to look at two groups. One group is the foreign immigrant doctors in the United States who practice East Asian medicine, and the Asian Americans. And now in the larger paper study that this comes from, I also look at the non-ethnically, non-Asians. Basically, I look at the Caucasian and the African-American students and practitioners. And I've done, a lot of this is driven by survey, by field observation, by interview, by classic sociological means of research. But the foreign doctors we talk about, and it's interesting because in the United States, there's only 3 states that license foreign trained providers. Most of the doctors that come out of Asia, either China, Japan, Korea, or Vietnam, they come with a highly Western influenced education, because in those countries, they've blended a lot of Western medicine along with their Eastern medical approaches. And they actually don't use the word Western medicine in most of those places. They use the word modern medicine. And they say traditional needs to meet modern for the benefit of the patient. So there's a scientific kind of model that many of these practitioners coming from these source countries have, with the idea that, oh, we want to maintain the best of the tradition and the best of the modern world. Okay. But in the US, many of these providers have a bit of a challenge. First, only 3 states will license them. Only New York, Massachusetts, and California allow foreign trained doctors to go right to licensure. Other states require them to get further training at one of the US schools, and which is kind of ironic. But the people who come from East Asia, many times they only kind of can work in 3 types of employment. One is in a shared subculture ethnic group, an ethnic enclave, a clinic that caters to people of the same ethnic group. Or they can work as an employee in a clinic that provides them patients, right? Many times bringing them in such that they're not necessarily directly related to the marketing, but they're working there. Or they could work in private practice, working with the mainstream patients who are available. So these are 3 major ways that the foreign doctors work. Now, if we look at the Asian American East Asian medical provider, and as I did this study, looking at those who do not necessarily have high fluency in the target language, or in they're not necessarily heritage speakers of the language so well. So they're kind of a little bit divorced in the way they're perceived from the people who are first generation immigrants. So this is young age immigrants, US born ethnic Asians. They pursue education in the US in East Asian medicine. So their education is highly influenced by these Orientalist trends in American society. They really have 2 big employment options. One is working in a clinic that provides patients, or another one is in private practice with mainstream patients, but they don't necessarily have the same cultural fit as the foreign trained doctors do with the ethnic enclaves, right? So they're a little bit divorced from that. So looking at these providers, really, how does this tie in with the Orientalizing? And we call it self-Orientalizing. This term has been coined and really looks at, in terms of Asian American studies, how do Asians present themselves, oftentimes in regard to the larger mainstream culture. So now both the foreign immigrant doctors and the US trained Asian Americans, they have a dynamic. It forces them to self-Orientalize to some extent. What does that mean? That means that the market in the US pushes them to adapt to the patient population, and they kind of adapt to this model of viewing Asian medicine as a wisdom tradition. Especially the foreign trained doctors have to kind of change the way they've thought about things as highly medical into a way that they present it as, oh, this is more a wisdom tradition, this is more elective. It kind of changes what they do. Oftentimes they're not able to order lab tests, order blood tests. Those things are not part of the privileges in most states. And there's 2 states that allow those lab tests to be ordered by East Asian medical license providers. But otherwise, they can't get those Western medical tests. So that's a very different relationship to the power structure, to the insurance structure. So they start to adapt trappings of stereotypes, and they shift their behavior to conform to patient expectation, because this is kind of a market-driven dynamic. So they're forced to create an identity, to created identity. It's not necessarily their natural identity that conforms to social expectation. So this really relates to the idea, Andrew Solomon has a theory of vertical and horizontal identity, which is that your vertical identity is your genetics and the amalgam of your societal, cultural, and historical forces, and horizontal identity is your personal experiences and attitudes. And these two social vectors kind of pull together the two aspects of identity, warp them together to create you. And if you're true to your vertical and horizontal identity, you have no cognitive dissonance. But the problem when you orientalize yourself is you act a certain way. Sometimes some of these providers take on an affective and fake accent. They talk a certain way. They present things a certain way. They kind of play a role. And this really is a violence unto themselves. So the need to conform, right, overwrites their sense of self. And it makes them script an external script of behavior. They're not behaving the way they want to. They're behaving the way they think they're supposed to. We call that in sociology a performativity metric, how you live up to your role. So the individual loses integrity, and really their sense of self is corrupted because it's expedient, it makes money, it gets the patient to pay, not so honest. So it erodes the ethical base of the individual, and maybe it makes them a little bit more unethical in general. That's a question. It also denies complete self-satisfaction because you can't be you. You're playing a role, right? And you're not a whole individual. It compromises your potential. So what does this do to the larger East Asian medical community? That's the question. So the individuals who experience this, it's a type of psychic violence. They're violence unto themselves. It creates damage on both the community and the tradition because there's a subtle shame. You're kind of playing a role. You're not really invested in what you do. And it makes the East Asian medical community a little less valid. So it limits the development in the field. It also gives it an air of charlatanry. It's not real. It's some sort of mystical thing. And it promotes profit over integrity, that the money to be made is more important than the integrity of the medicine. Also, there's a loss of potential development. This is one of the oldest continuously practiced forms of medicine. East Asian medicine goes back way into prehistory, and it's still practiced, much like Ayurvedic medicine in India and such, but these are traditions that last a long time, and they are corrupted from social forces, not medical concerns. So how does this conclude? Because time being what it is, I've identified this self-orientalization within the East Asian medical community as having a subtle but profound impact on both the Asian American practitioners. It sits on a Orientalist platform of American culture that thinks of East Asia still as far off and different. And it coalesces these two vertical and horizontal identity dynamics to create a lateralizing force, a force in their personality. It degrades the integrity that they feel in themselves due to the self-orientalization. So this process in the community is one expression of the complexity of the American cultural tapestry that is theoretically a melting pot, but it's more like a tossed salad, a mixture, and how these dynamics play out, and where race and ethnicity combine either to empower or corrupt the population. So that's the presentation, right? It's part of a larger work. I'm hoping to publish this larger work within the Proceedings Journal from the conference. And as I wrap up, I just would like to say thank you to the conference organizers and thank you to you guys for listening. And we're going to be moving on to the next presentation, but time being what it is, hopefully this gave you a little snippet of a way to look at social dynamics within medicine. Thank you.